welcome to FO Live. With me are two people, one a legend and one more youthful and dressed in a dapper fashion and a Washington, D.C. creature. Anyway, so without further ado, I welcome Bob Blackwell and Richard Fontaine to speak about Lost Decade. And they are going to be talking about their book. Actually, that is the title of their book. So tell me, gentlemen, why did you title the book Lost Decade?
Well, you'll see when you have a chance to read it in detail.
The 480 pages, I skimmed it.
Yeah, well, none of us have enough time to read every book we'd like. But in 2011, Hillary Clinton wrote an article at the end of the year for Foreign Policy magazine, in which
October 2011, 6,000 words.
Yeah, right. And in which she announced an enormous change in U.S. grand strategy. That is to say, the United States was going to pivot to Asia and was going to devote, in the first instance, its resources, its time, and its attention for the first time in its history to Asia. Because throughout its history, the United States had been a Europe first nation. We believe, Richard and I, and the book stresses this, that the Obama administration was strategically correct in 2011 when it called for a pivot to Asia. But sadly, this revolution in U.S. grand strategy never happened. Despite
so why not, Bob? Well, why not?
Let me just go on just for a minute, if I might, and then we can certainly get to the why nots. Despite this rise, astonishing rise, we call it in our book, of Chinese power during the 2010s, the U.S. did not pivot to Asia, and indeed today, the U.S. is in a much weaker position in Asia in the balance of military power and the economic domain and diplomatic influence than it was when Hillary Clinton announced the pivot in 2011. So the lost decade, to answer your question, was the 2010s, when China was rising dramatically, and the U.S. Was not taking the steps necessary to deal with it throughout the 2010s.
So, Bob, just to make a point, I have actually skimmed through the book, and I certainly read the first few chapters and indeed the last chapter with great attention. And this is for our viewers and listeners, why you titled it The Lost Decade. Now, let's get straight into the thick of it. Asia pivot. Asia pivot occurs basically a decade after China enters the WTO. 2001 is when China enters the WTO. And 2001 is also 9/11, and America gets distracted in the Middle East. And both of you have said that apart from the Vietnamese escalation, apart from the American escalation in Vietnam in 1965, the 2003 invasion of Iraq is the other big strategic blunder. So now you do have a recognition in 2011. Hillary Clinton pens a big op-ed, but the US is unable to A, extricate itself out of the Middle East, and B, shift focus entirely to Asia, and C, once Trump gets elected, Trans-Pacific TPP partnership, which American diplomats spend decades, or maybe if not decades, many years negotiating, gets thrown out of the window. So my question to you is a simple one, and I'd like both of you to weigh in. Was Asia pivot merely rhetoric or intention? Intention as in New Year's intention, I will diet and have a lean waist, but then I don't hit the gym and I don't cut out cookies and switch to salad?
Well, there certainly was intention there, and there was
Yeah.
certainly rhetoric.
Yeah.
And in the immediate aftermath of the 2011 announcement that the U.S. was going to pivot, there was stepped up diplomacy, and the real crunch came in a couple of ways. One was on the military side. The assumption was that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were winding down and that there would be a peace dividend from them and would allow for the reallocation of defense resources to Asia. That those wars didn't actually wind down as anticipated. And on top of that, we had the so-called sequestration, so huge hits to the defense budget. So the military budget was contracting precisely as you weren't seeing the ability to reallocate those things. Of course, in 2014, what had seemed like a quiescent Europe saw the annexation of Crimea by Russia, and we know the story as you roll that clock forward. You already mentioned on the economic side that TPP was successfully negotiated and brought to conclusion, but it was not approved by the Congress. The Obama administration waited until the end of its term to try to get it done, couldn't get it done, and then Trump withdrew from it. And then the diplomacy turned out to be up and down, depending on who was Secretary of State and who was National Security Advisor and what their priorities were and what events were going on in the world. And so when you sort of net it all out, you don't see, as Bob was saying, you don't see the pivot of resources, time, and attention from Europe and the Middle East to Asia as had been intended. And then, around about 2021, when Joe Biden comes into the White House, there's this renewed effort to pivot to Asia, not in precisely the same language, but essentially the same concept. And they actually have made some progress on a number of fronts, but it's belated, hence the lost decade, and it's partial. We still don't have a trade pillar. Some of the steps that need to be taken have not yet been taken, and so forth. And so that's really the story of kind of what happened over the long run here.
Excellent. So please educate our listeners and our viewers about the need for Asia pivot in 2011. I've alluded to it. What was the need? And in 6,000 words, Hillary Clinton did not mention Russia in that famous or now infamous op-ed.
Well, let me address that, if I might, and Richard will chime in. And I'll use current numbers, but they were emerging in 2011 and were ever more prominent in the U.S. public debate. It's difficult to overstate Asia's significance. Let me just go through a mouthful of statistics, but I think your readers will appreciate, or listeners will appreciate them. Asia is the home of 60% of the world's population, 3 of the 5 largest national economies, 40% of global GDP, 2/3 of the world's economic growth, 41% of international exports, and 37% of global imports, half of the world's active military personnel, 6 of the 10 biggest armies, 4 of the 10 highest defense budgets, 5 of the 9 nuclear weapon states, 6 of the 10 major carbon emitters, and of course, these days, we've come to realize belatedly that our only geopolitical rival is in Asia, of course, China. And this leads me to conclude by making this point. When the pivot was unveiled in 2011, there was a rough consensus in Washington, but it was very different than the rough consensus that exists now. In 2011, there was still the hope among, I think, the majority of American strategists and politicians that China could be persuaded to become a responsible stakeholder, to use Bob Zelott's term. And the elite, the U.S. strategic elite, political elite, continued to hope for that long after it was obvious in the 2010s that that was not China's intent, that China had a very different agenda, which was to replace the United States as the most important power in Asia. And indeed, it wasn't until near the middle of the Trump administration that an American administration finally released a strategic document which confirmed that China was a major power competitor with the United States. So the consensus we have now did not exist then, and their basic concept through those years, the administrations, was we will engage and hedge. The problem is, as Richard just said in a different way, we did a lot more engaging than we did hedging.
I see. Now, one of the things you talk about towards the end of your book, and you mentioned maintaining world order, you talk about 4 strategic principles, and among them, of course, you talk about articulating a positive vision, endorsing America's global role, calculating trade-offs amid great power competition, pursuing unity. And in the to-do list, you mention strengthening U.S. alliances in the Indo-Pacific. And there is, of course, the Quad now. There is, of course, a treaty with the Philippines now. So in the interest of time, I wish we could talk much longer about this, but Richard has to go. What is it that the US needed to do in this decade? And what is it that it should do now? And also, I would request, that we keep in mind the constraints that have emerged with 2 wars raging right now. One, of course, the Russia-Ukraine war, and one, the Israel and Hamas war, both of which are also taking time, energy, money, resources, and intention on the part of US policymakers. Over to you, sirs.
Well, first, I can stay a little bit longer, actually, if
Lovely.
If our host would like to continue the chat. I mean, from the Indian perspective, I think the views of the United States and India, broadly speaking, have increasingly converged over the years. It's been one of the very rare, sustained, bipartisan elements of U.S. foreign policy dating back to the George W. Bush administration, when Bob Blackwell was ambassador to India, and carried forward all the way to the present day to increasingly align the activities and outlooks of the United States and India. I think that's been especially true on China. China's clearly helped a lot in that regard on the Indian front, and it's all to the good that the United States and India are growing closer together in every way that they can, especially on the security side of things. You hit on the biggest challenge of a pivot to Asia, which Bob and I in the book call for a renewed effort, which is, okay, well, what about the rest of the world? And it is not the answer that the United States suddenly becomes a regional power focused only and exclusively on Asia, nor
That's
is it
impossible, given its status as a global hegemon.
We are a global power. We have interests in and commitments in multiple regions of the world. Europe and the Middle East are of obvious importance to the United States. So we're not going to become a regional power. We're not going to be, we will remain a global power, but you have to make trade-offs and you have to set priorities, because you can't do everything everywhere all at once. And so we offer some ideas about how to maintain commitments and protect our interests and relationships in Europe and the Middle East while increasing the share of national security resources, time, and attention that are going to Asia. So, for example, it has been cited over the years that, you know, the United States is withdrawing from the Middle East, or wants to withdraw from the Middle East, or would like to get out. And this has been a pervasive sentiment in the region itself. Well, the United States has done exactly the opposite in the Middle East. We're there in about the same force levels militarily and sustained level of diplomacy that we were before the pivot was announced. But we fed this notion that we're getting out because that's based on our performance, our perceived performance, rather than how many troops we have on the ground, how many air bases we have, where the Fifth Fleet is, and things like that. So you could actually have the reallocation of military resources from the Middle East to Asia while improving our performance and the perception that we meet our commitments there in a way that would actually allow for a sort of a latter-day pivot. So those are some of the things we get at.
Could I just add, there's an irony here, since Richard addressed the U.S.-India relationship, and I agree with everything he said. But I think my old friend Jaishankar, the foreign minister of India, would find it an odd idea that India should only be a regional power. He doesn't suffer the myopia of some American strategists. And of course, India is ever more vigorous in reaching out to the rest of the world. And it is a curiosity that in America, the longtime global power, there are those who argue that it should become a regional power. So that's a striking difference between at least some of the elites, the strategic elites of the two countries. I think it's also fair to say, and Richard is the Washingtonian here, but I think that the idea that the U.S. should only concentrate on China, and ignore our vital national interests in Europe and the Middle East is still a minority view in the United States. It gets a lot of attention through its marketing and of the notion, but I think it's still a minority view.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and
So-
you can, I was just say you can look at what actual policymakers are doing. Look at the current administration. Where is the Secretary of State? He's in the Middle East. Where is a U.S. carrier battle group? It's stationed off the coast of Israel. Which country got the greatest share of the national security aid supplemental that passed the Congress? It was Ukraine. Who got the second? It was Israel. There was some money in there for the Indo-Pacific, but it was, you know, less than 10%, and so on and so on and so on. You can look at the Congress and things like that. So I think what you're seeing everywhere among actual policymakers is this struggle to balance our attention and resources across what I think almost everyone now acknowledges are simultaneous priorities. We've got you know, equities and interests in Europe and the Middle East, but we've got this long-term challenge in China, in Asia. How do you deal with the long-term challenge when there are crises in other parts of the world? That's sort of the conundrum that really each administration since the announcement of the pivot has in one way or another had to deal with.
And
So I mentioned,
can I just say, just in a
please.
couple of sentences, in the Middle East, we, as Richard said, have basically the same force structure as we had in 2011. We argue that some of that, especially air and naval, can be moved to Asia. And then in crises like the Gaza war, as we did, we can surge forces into the Middle East. They don't have to be permanently stationed there. And in Europe, as our European allies, as they're doing, most of them increasing their defense budget and their force structures, we too there think we can move forces, especially again air and naval, to Asia. This is based in Europe on our judgment that the likelihood of a Russian attack on a NATO member, thus activating Article 5 and the U.S. Major role in that war, seems highly unlikely to us. If Putin were to move against, say, the Baltic states, then he would trigger Article 5, and we could be on our way to a nuclear war. And Richard and I don't think that's likely. But again, if that were to happen, we would surge forces, but would be dealing with a much weaker Russian military than existed during the Cold War.
Let's talk about Philippines, which I mentioned earlier, and Japan, because any mention of Asia pivot and alliances has to involve these two countries. American forces have been in Japan since 1945. The Japanese Constitution was influenced by the Americans, actually created by the Americans, and in Japan, of course, there always has been a reliance on the US. Less so of late. I have very close Japanese friends, as I'm sure you do too. And Philippines under Duterte flirted a bit with China, but now has come back to the fold. There's a new treaty. So where does the network of alliances, which underpins to some degree, to great degree, America's global power, NATO in Europe, other allies elsewhere, but Philippines and Japan in particular in Asia, how does that play a role in the Asia pivot strategy and what both of you are proposing as grand strategy?
They play a critical role. And if you step back and look at the change in Japan's defense strategy, other than China's rise itself, this is the most important thing happening in Asia security today. Japan has made a commitment to double the size of its defense budget over 5 years.
Yes, sir.
So in the next few years, it will have the third biggest defense budget in the world. So bigger than India's, bigger than China, second only to bigger than Russia's, second only to the United States, or third to only the United States and China. It's also acquiring offensive strike capabilities that would allow it to hold at risk places in North Korea and in China. It's relaxing the restrictions previously imposed on when and how it could use forces in a contingency. Increasingly, Japanese policymakers, for example, will say, at least privately, that it's almost unthinkable that Japan would not be involved if there was some Taiwan contingency. That's new.
Exactly.
And of course, the United States and Japan are working to the greater trying to operationalize to a better degree the U.S.-Japan relationship. We don't have a joint command the way we do on the Korean Peninsula. We have separate commands, but they're working together more closely than they did in the past and starting to plan for things that they had not yet before. And then on the Philippines side, under President Marcos, it's really taken some major steps forward with the Philippines making available military installations in the Philippines to U.S. forces. We've come a long way since the U.S. was kicked out of Clark and Subic in 1991. And so those sort of bilateral alliances are taking major steps forward as we speak. But the other thing that's going on is a networking of U.S. partners and allies across the region. So it had always been the case. It was a hub and spoke system. The United States is allied with each of the 5 treaty allies in Asia and partners with countries like India, but none of them were allied with each other. They're still not allied with each other, but Japan and the Philippines, for example, are working together more closely. Japan and India are working together on defense more closely than they ever have before. Japan and Australia are working together more closely. So what you're seeing is, in some ways, sort of a classic balancing reaction to the rise of Chinese power, with the United States at the center, but not the exclusive actor there. And so that ultimately is key, because as Bob said at the beginning of this, China's rise in power has been astonishing in its scope. And so it's working together with allies and partners that's going to repair the balance of power in the region.
Quad, just to add something to what you said, the Quad was Shinzo Abe's idea. It was not something the US created. So Japan has certainly become more assertive. And even before Shinzo Abe, Junichiro Koizumi began a more assertive Japanese foreign policy. So Japan has been turning around, actually had to turn around because the threat by China, and of course the appeal to anti-Japanese sentiment because of Japanese atrocities during World War II, is part of the appeal that the Chinese Communist Party uses to legitimize its rule. So in some ways, Japan has had no choice. My question to you is there an economic component like the TPP now in the offing? Is that something that you sit in Washington, you're the best man, Richard, to talk about this? Is there something that the US is now seriously considering, at least in policy circles?
No, is the short answer to that question. TPP was, by 2016, unpopular with both political parties. It was impossible to get done. Trump pulled out of the TPP. The other countries moved forward with the CPTPP without the United States.
And the RCEP, which the Chinese brought in.
Well, exactly. So now there are two pan-regional Asian trade agreements. China is party to one, RCEP. China has applied to join the other, CPTPP. The United States is party to neither, wishes to join neither, and is offering no alternative to them. So that's the stark reality of where we are. I mean, that's really a product of our own domestic politics. This is not a policy judgment that these things are not valuable or something. I think there's broad acknowledgement that it would be very good for the United States to have an affirmative trade policy, but it's run afoul of our own domestic politics. We'll see. The one thing we know about the forthcoming election is that either of the candidates will be in their second term, which sometimes makes trade initiatives more available than they would be to candidates or presidents in their first term. But we're in a pretty protectionist moment in the United States right now. So one of the things that Bob and I say, other than, yes, it would be great to be back in and get into the CPTPP, is if that proves a political bridge too far, there's a lot that can be done between here and there, which includes digital trade agreements, either a regional digital trade agreement or bilateral ones with countries like Japan or Singapore or others. And there could be sectoral agreements and things like that that could become useful stepping stones to something more ambitious.
The issue of the allies, which of course is comes to mind when we talk about trade agreements, is absolutely crucial as the United States, we hope, works with more effectiveness to deal with the rise of Chinese power. We can't successfully deal with China without our allies for a variety of reasons. And this brings to mind the unfortunate point, but it's one that we should learn over time, that when the Obama-Clinton team launched the 2011 pivot, there was virtually no consultation with our allies in any of the regions, beginning in the Indo-Pacific, but also in Europe and the Middle East, before it was announced. And so, of course, the diplomats in Washington did what they are paid to do, which they rushed to the administration to say, what's this? What is this pivot? And we did a great deal of interviewing of the folks who were involved during those weeks. And the essential answer was nobody in the administration had a good answer to what is this pivot. And when the Europeans said, what does this mean for Article 5 and the US commitment to defend Europe? Of course, the administration at the time responded with a bromide, which was, oh no, it won't weaken it. And then he said, well, how can it not weaken it if you're pivoting? And our friends in the Middle East said a version of the same thing, and they got no answer. And as we interviewed years later, there still was no consensus on the people who launched the pivot of what it was meant to accomplish. Which leads me to one other point about the Allies, and this is, again, the subject of increasing debate here, centered on U.S. assistance to Ukraine, with some Americans arguing, some Americans of some stature arguing it's time for the United States to get out of Ukraine and concentrate our efforts on, say, defending Taiwan, strengthening our posture in Asia and so forth. Richard and I argue in the book that this would be a terrible mistake and a terrible signal for our Asian allies. Because if you're, since we were talking about Japan, if you were a Japanese policymaker and the United States, having said that the future of Ukraine was critical to the United States, just got tired of it, what would you conclude with respect to the reliability of the Americans to come to Japan's aid, consistent with the U.S. security treaty we have with Japan? So these regions, this comes as no shock to you, but these regions all are inextricably connected because America's a global power.
Just one thing to add to what Bob said about the formation of this idea in 2011 that is an interesting insight sometimes into the policy process. And one of the reasons why the Obama administration didn't consult with allies in advance of all these other things is because most of the folks, if not all of them at the time, didn't think that they were actually announcing some radical departure with Secretary Clinton's initial article. And so, you know, Bob and I have worked in government, Bob, let's say substantially more than me. However, you know, one of the great complaints of people, policymakers in government is no one paid attention to that speech. No one read the article by my principal. You know, oh, you have this question, just go read the thing. Nobody paid attention and didn't get enough coverage. Here, all of a sudden, they put out this article, and it was intended to sort of summarize where the administration was going, big picture, and where it wanted to go. And suddenly everybody's reading it with this scriptural exegesis, looking for, you know, word choice and how many, you know, this and that. And suddenly you had policymakers saying exactly the opposite. Oh, you're reading too much into it. It was just a summary. No, you know, don't take it, you know, like gospel and all this other stuff. And then it started to build this momentum of its own externally, but also internally. And so, you know, the idea that it encapsulated, maybe not fully in the minds of even some who authored it, was a good one, and started to have this momentum in subsequent speeches, and the president and the Secretary of State and the Pentagon and everybody else came out. And then it produced all these questions that Bob was saying, which is, all right, if you're going to pivot to Asia, what's that mean for everybody else? And what does it mean for Asia, by the way? So
we had negative reactions from all three regions, and the Europeans worried that we would not defend them if we were pivoting. The Middle Easterners thought, well, we've thought the Americans are going home, and this proves it. And in Asia, in the Indo-Pacific, there was fear, widespread fear, that the Americans were going to force them, or try to force them, to choose between the United States and China. And so everywhere it was greeted with great apprehension. And we got the worst of both worlds. We got the apprehension and anxiety generated by our statement we were pivoting when we didn't pivot. And meanwhile, the Chinese continued persistently and systematically to build their power. On the military side, we quote in the book Harold Brown, who said about the Soviet Union, when we build, they build. When we don't build, they build. And that's what happened in the military balance in Asia between the United States and China during the lost decade.
Interesting. Now, you talked about anxiety and apprehension. I have said this for the last few years, and so has my co-author, Glenn Carl. We think China presents the biggest strategic challenge to the US in its history because of the size and scale of its economy, because of its population, because it is the world's factory, it is the world's biggest exporter, and so on and so forth. With the Russia-Ukraine war kicking off, increasingly, Russia is being funded by Chinese purchases of oil. Of course, India is purchasing Russian oil too. The volume is greater when it comes to China. And as a student of history, I cannot but think back to Germany and Austria-Hungary. Germany was the manufacturing power. Austria-Hungary was an empire. China is the manufacturing power. Russia is still an inheritor of the Russian Empire. After all, there was the dash to the Pacific in the 19th century by two countries, manifest destiny in the US, and of course the Russians came all the way and once had Alaska, which they sold to you. So do you see a China-Russia partnership emerging like Germany and Austria-Hungary? And do you think that'll strengthen with the melting of the Arctic? After all, the Arctic route has become a reality to some degree. And what do you think the US can do, and what do you think the US will do in response?
Well, Bob and I are in another project that we're working on, looking precisely at some of the questions you just described, which is what is the relationship with China and Russia, and what does this mean for the United States and its friends and allies? And I think the relationship between China and Russia has not been this close, at least since the Sino-Soviet split, and
That's
so
true.
a very long time. And it has very concrete manifestations. You talked about China buying Russian oil, which is absolutely the case. But as the Western export controls have bitten into Russia's ability to acquire parts for its war machine, China has stepped in and supplied an enormous amount of dual-use goods to Russia that is keeping that war machine going. China and Russia have announced what they call a no limits partnership. It turns out there are limits to that partnership, but Putin and Xi Jinping have a close interpersonal kind of intimacy and collaboration. They're increasingly working as well with Iran and North Korea in what my colleague and I in an article in Foreign Affairs referred to as the axis of upheaval.
I read that.
But also creating a narrative, an alternative narrative to what they view as an anachronistic, unfair, unbalanced, Western-dominated international order that doesn't accord to them the space, the sphere of influence, the rights to maintain their own political system, and so forth that they believe they deserve, and they're determined together to do something about it. So in the first instance, that means China supporting Russia in this war, and you're just going to see more of that kind of collaboration into the future.
Those who say that this entente, it's not yet an alliance between China and Russia, is only superficial, don't have the facts. And in our research on the subject, including for the book, it is quite dramatic how fast their collaboration, diplomatic, economic, and military, has proceeded. And it's only going to gain strength because they both have the same objective, which is to overturn the US-led liberal world order. And it's hard to see that changing. At least we, Richard and I, find it hard to imagine that changing any time soon. So we're going to have to deal with it. And again, to reinforce the point, we cannot deal with it without our allies and friends, because it's an even more formidable challenge with the two of them together, although it's also important to remember that there's only one country in the world that can actually take the lead in upending the global order, and that's China and not Russia. But together, they can cause all sorts of difficulties for us around the world. I also wanted just to chime in just one small point, but telling about whether the U.S. Is now concentrating on Asia, which of course it isn't. It's not just that Secretary Blinken has just been in Jerusalem and Riyadh again, but the American president was in Europe and has come home briefly and is going back to Europe. But he's going back to Europe this time for a G7 meeting. And again, as we have this debate in the United States about the future of American grand strategy, we Americans usually do not put enough emphasis on our requirement to consult with our allies and friends, partners, and to take their views into account. And there was recently an assertion in Foreign Affairs in an article that the United States should seek regime change in China, and that would indicate a victory for the United States in this contest with China. But typically, I fear for we Americans, that article and other similar assertions did not take into account that if we did articulate that as a policy objective, we would be absolutely alone in the world. And nobody, no country in Asia would join us in such a policy objective, and no country in Europe or the Middle East or anywhere else would join us. But it's a good example of we Americans don't take sufficient account of the fact we need our allies to be successful in the world.
Understood. In your view, Russia and China are already a de facto alliance, though, and lest we forget, Russia is an Asian power as well. It took islands off Japan at the end of World War II, and arguably, geographically at least, most of Russian territory lies in Asia.
Yes, Vladivostok was once a Chinese city. So, depending on how far back you want to roll the clock, Russia is a Pacific power, and its Far East is certainly in Asia and so forth. I would say it's it's not, Russia and China are not allies in the sense that they would defend each other. I mean, China's not fighting for Russia and Ukraine. If China found itself in a war with anyone over Taiwan, Russia is extremely unlikely to join that kind of fight. So there are limits to this. It's not an alliance with a mutual defense agreement, but short of that, you see a lot of quite consequential collaboration that makes the execution of U.S. foreign policy more difficult in the ways that we were describing, because they, collaborate on military and things like that, but also in the economic sphere, where they're increasingly trying to develop alternatives to the dollar as a means of payment and so forth, which undermines the efficacy of U.S. sanctions. They clearly don't like U.S. sanctions and so forth. So these are relatively new phenomena, but they've got a lot of differences among them. But the glue that holds them together is opposition to what they see as an unfair U.S.-led global order that doesn't accord to China and Russia the rights and the weight and the status and the spheres of influence that they believe they deserve by virtue of their history, their size, their power, and all of that.
We're nearing the end. I just want to say in a few words that readers of the book will notice that we spend a good deal of effort and time in the book stressing that the quality of U.S. diplomacy toward China, as we build up our alliances and strengthen our deterrence in Asia, is important. And it's important because the most obvious place that the U.S. would go to war in the period ahead is in Asia, related to Taiwan. And
I was going to end on Taiwan. I'm glad that you've raised Taiwan yourself, Bob.
Well, let me just say, and I'll just say it briefly, is that we are in a situation in which U.S.-China relations are in a downward spiral strategically, although both leaders wanted a pretty calm 2024. Biden because of the presidential election, and Xi Jinping because of the difficulties of the Chinese economy. But the trend lines are very worrisome. And of course, a war between the United States and China would be a global catastrophe. But so far, there's no progress in diplomacy with respect to lessening the tensions across the Taiwan Straits. So we deal at length in the book about the need not only for diplomacy with our friends and allies, but also in this case, competent diplomacy with respect to our relations with China.
So your colleague at Harvard Kennedy School, Graham Ellison, wrote the book, The Thucydides Trap, in which he made the argument that rising powers and ruling powers often clash, and only rarely do they avoid such a clash. Gentlemen, final question to both of you. How hopeful are you that the US and China will display the wisdom, sagacity, diplomacy, judgment, and nous to avoid World War III?
I'm more optimistic than pessimistic. I mean, the chances of a war between the United States and China are significant, given our differences, particularly over Taiwan, but they sure are not inevitable. And I think both sides know, or should know, how catastrophic a fight between the United States and China could become. And for everything that they care about, their people, the world economy, and everything else. So we've got big differences, but the incentives to avoid such a war are very significant still. And to Bob's point, it's going to be the management of those differences over time that really gives the answer, I think, to your question.
And I just add a sentence that the stronger our deterrent is in Asia, the less likely for China to take aggressive military action against Taiwan. And that's the reason we emphasize that, as you saw so much in the final chapter of the book.
Brilliant. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. I recommend to our readers, to our viewers, to get a copy of their book. Read The Lost Decade. It's only 480 pages long, so you can read it just in one night. Thank you very much, both. See you again soon.
Thank you
Thanks
for having me.
having us. Bye-bye.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.